Welcome to the Plugged In Podcast by Sweetwater. I'm your host, Mitch Gallagher. This time, we'll be coming to you from the control room in Sweetwater Studio A. We're back with another in-depth conversation with engineer, producer, musician, and YouTube personality Warren Huart. Warren was visiting Sweetwater to record videos both for us and for his channel, which, by the way, if you're at all interested in recording music, then Warren's channel, Produce Like a Pro, is something you definitely want to check out. For this installment of the Plugged In Podcast, Warren and I will be delving into topics that are near and dear to both of our hearts. We'll be talking about guitar, and specifically talking about amp modeling and getting great recorded guitar tones. We're going to have some fun, so please stay tuned. With all that said, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Plugged In Podcast by Sweetwater. Settle in, and let's get started. I'm coming to you from Studio A here at Sweetwater. Special guest will be Warren Huart.
Mitch, great to see you, as ever.
Always a pleasure.
Yep.
It's not your first time here.
No, this is, it's actually the second time being here for a decent period of time, but it's the third time I've been here because the first time I came out to ring out a stadium.
Oh, wow.
You know the ice hockey stadium a few miles away?
Yeah.
I went down there and I did impulse responses of it a few years ago. You probably know this, but my old engineer is Mike Arango, and like a proper engineer. We've made records together, and he's from this area. And after a few years in LA, he said, I just want to go back home. And he came back here.
He's a sales engineer.
A sales engineer. But he'd actually flew backwards and forwards from LA and got the job with you guys. I think he was one of 65 people in those days.
Wow.
Because it's about 18 years ago now, or 17 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy how it's grown.
But I remember thinking Sweetwater was big then.
Yeah.
It seemed to be big, Oh, wow, there's like 65 people. That's a big music store.
Right.
Now, how many is it now?
Order of magnitude beyond that, I think, just about 2,800 or something total in the company.
Wow.
So, yeah, pretty crazy. Well, we're here today to talk about something that's near and dear to both our hearts.
Marvelous.
That's recording guitars.
We do love recording guitars, yes.
Things have changed a lot. I mean, there are now, it used to be you had one choice. You put a microphone in front of an amplifier.
Yeah.
Which that still is a choice.
It still is a choice, yeah.
There are other choices now as well that we see all the time.
Yeah, I think this conversation is always incredibly genre specific. Mm-hmm. I think on sort of the extremes and everywhere in the middle, there's so much choice. If you go to the obvious extreme of like metal and hard hitting, very impactful in your face guitars, virtual amps are starting to really kind of win.
Right.
Having said that, one of the disadvantages in anything, whether actually not even just guitar sounds, but in any kind of virtual instrument, is the fact that everybody has access to it. So, there's a lot of criticism that you read, under every video of like, oh, that's the same guitar sound on every song, or the same drum sound. And so I think one of the beauties of miking things up, even if you just end up blending them with other sources, is of course that when you do something, you mic it up with your amp in your room, with your mic pre, with your compressor and your EQ. It is completely and utterly your own sound.
Right.
And I think back to working with Dave Jordan in the late 90s and early 2000s. He had just finished Americana by Offspring. And for those people that don't know that record, the guitar sounds are fantastic. And I said to him, I was like, how did you get those guitar sounds? And believe it or not, it was a ton of amps, 57s, Royers, front and back miking on cabs and stuff, but blended with amp farm. So he was in there early on trying to change things up because there was like amp farm, which people sort of felt was a little synthetic. And then of course, but they still wanted the big guitar sounds. And he had his own unique way of doing stuff because his guitar recording was incredible. But he blended the two together and it was like, that was something that was completely unique at the time.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, that's 98 or something, 99?
Yeah.
Here we are 25 years later, essentially, thinking that way.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that at the time I was at EQ Magazine, and as each of those things would come out, Amp Farm and the Pod, and all those things were like, we finally arrived, we can finally do direct recording and all that. But really, today's tools, it's gotten pretty fantastic, whether you're talking about a plug-in, or a virtual amp, or an aux box, or something that capture your real amp, if you will. It's interesting the way that all that has come together. But I totally agree with you that blending seems to be the way that gives the best results.
Definitely gives you the most individuality.
Most individuality, yeah.
Yeah, I think especially if you've got a bedroom studio, so you've got a limited way of working, but you might be able to put up a small combo. Mm-hmm. And bearing in mind, Dave Jordan's biggest guitar sounds, like when he was doing Alice in Chains, were small combos. His thing was he really loved front and back miking. So he would take like Pro Juniors and 8-inch, 6-inch speakers and put a 57 on the front and then a 57 on the open back, and then just reverse the polarity, flip the phase on the back one, and blend them together. And you just get that little extra low end,
right?
But you get all that aggression on the front. And it's interesting, so many people over the years have said the biggest guitar sounds come from the smallest amps.
Dating back to Clapton with Layla and the little champs and things. When I interviewed Warren Haynes, he of course records stacks and big amps and things, but he always has a very small amplifier that he focuses on for the mid-range of his tone. And so an interesting approach is to think about just a very specific thing that a tool is going to provide for you, whether it's a microphone, whether it's an amplifier, whether it's a virtual solution, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think it's physics as well that people forget. When I first started in music, I worked in a music store in the town close to my village. It was called Kingfisher Music. And I really gravitated towards recording really, really quickly. But I was a guitar player as well. And I remember somebody coming in saying, I can't get the guitar sound that I hear in my rehearsal room. And I was like, what do you mean? And they described it. They were like, yeah, I come in through the door, and my guitar player's playing guitar and it sounds massive. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, where are you putting the mic? And they're like, well, about here on the cone. And I was like, try putting a mic where you're standing in the room. It sounds so obvious, but logic does tend to go out the window quite often, and we start thinking that there's some other secret. The reality is big amps, when you're close miking them, are just the same as small amps. If you want that low end and that sound in the room, then you're going to need to pull back because your low end needs to develop, or you're going to have to come up with some tricks that are going to dial in that extra low end or some EQ, etc. And if you want the sound of a massive room, then you better mic the room.
Right.
But if you're in a small bedroom environment, maybe you don't have that opportunity. But things like the aux are really useful. And I think one thing that we haven't touched upon, which I think is huge, that made the difference between like early Amp Farm and Amplitude when it first came out, was the fact that they didn't really understand impulse responses.
Right.
They didn't realize that the speaker was actually more influential than anything else. Mm-hmm. And I think once they figured that out, that just changed the whole ball game.
Right.
Because I like a lot of the stuff. I like the Paul Reed Smith one. To be honest, everybody makes a good one if you know how to use it. Mm-hmm. And in some instances, I like the left of center ones because they might not be as popular, but then you can blend them and get sort of more unique things.
Right.
Like I said, one of the biggest things I see in discussions is people buy an album and they're like, it's the same guitar sound in every song. Mm-hmm. It's the same drum sound in every song.
Right. And even a solution to that can be just don't use the presets.
Yeah.
At least go in and shape the sound to make it a little bit more specific. So I'm curious, your approach then, are you, like what I often do now is I'll record the direct guitar, mm-hmm. I'll record something mic'd, maybe something through an aux, and then I have the option later to reamp, to run through a plug-in or whatever it might be. What is your approach these days?
Basically very similar. I like all kinds of things. I do still really love small amps. Mm-hmm. We have a Champ. We have 2 different Pro Juniors. Those are great. Carl Martin brought out an amp a few years ago. I doubt if they still make it. It was called the Roadie. That's really fun. I would say, gun to my head, if I only had one amp, it would probably be a Pro Junior. And then second, a Vox AC15. I love the way those things sound.
Yeah.
Nice mid-range and cut. But what gets used a lot is my Tone Master. People love to hate that amp, but it does everything because it's a deluxe. It's a 65 deluxe, but it is the modeling amp. That's my plug-in, as it were. Mm-hmm. So I'll plug into that. It's an amp. I'm used to it. I can hear it in the room. I can experience playing the guitar, but I'll come out of that, out the back, through one of the built-in impulse responses and blend that with my Pro Junior.
Right.
The Pro Junior might be the nose and the point and probably 75% of the sound, but that Tone Master is just a really great way of getting the deluxe sound really quickly, really easily, and I get to experience being in a room and feeling an amp. So what I mean is, like, I can be in this room with the amp. Mm-hmm. I don't need to put on headphones.
Right.
I can have the track playing through here and I've got an amp there, I'm playing to the track. Because the only other problem with working in virtual is like you don't have that sort of experience of being by an amp and maybe getting some feedback and things like that. You could maybe try it through your speakers. It's not a very healthy way of going, though, you know.
Right.
So I do enjoy that interaction. But at the end of the day, there is no one way that I work. We have JCM 900, another very ignored amp, which I absolutely love. But I also have JMPs, Engels, in fact, quite a few Engels that I really, really love. I have their Ritchie Blackmore, I think it's called the Artist series. That's a great sounding amp. It's like a Marshall on steroids.
Right.
You know, all of these are wonderful amps that you get used to, and then you sort of just, in the back of your mind, after you've had them for a few months and you've messed around with them, you know to go to there, off you go. You know, it's a luxury that I have a lot of different things so I can go between them. But, you know, guns to my head, Pro Junior, AC-15, and some kind of Marshall. Pretty much got it covered. You've got Fender, Vox, Marshall.
Yeah. 3 food groups.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And from there, you can put pedals with them.
Oh,
or
God,
you can process, and there's all kinds of, as you mentioned, you can put IRs on things and work with virtual stuff as well.
Yep.
So that's a very versatile setup. I have lately been really enjoying the Synergy system, which are the modules that go in the rack. And I'll sometimes run those out to speakers so that I have the 50-watt rack mount amp, and it goes with it, and so then you can switch from a Tweed Fender to a Marshall to a Diesel to whatever. But I also run those through a Mesa Boogie Cab Clone IR Plus, and that allows you to load in IRs. You can come in, line in, and get the IR that way as well, and process after the fact. So that's a super versatile system.
Yeah, I need to try that. They actually, a friend of mine had that a couple of years ago and brought it over, and we just were so busy we never got to really try it out properly.
Yeah.
But I hear great things about it. I think for me, the other thing really to touch upon it is microphone choice and placement. You know, there's all kinds of ways of doing it. There's the technique that Terry Date had with the 2 capsules like this, which I think in the 2000s became known as the Friedman technique, but it was originally a Terry Date thing from like late 80s and 90s, where you take 2 capsules and point them like this. And I really, that can be really, really great for super distorted guitars where you're trying to get a bit of the edge of the cone and a bit of the center of the cone. You're trying to blend that together. Totally understand why people would use that. And then open back, like I said, I love to put a mic behind and reverse the polarity and then blend it up. You know, it gives a very kind of sound, but just enough of it just adds a bit of meat, a bit of low end to it, and takes that little 6 or 8 inch speaker and makes it sound like a much bigger thing. Yeah. 57s tend to get used a lot. They're a sort of go-to because they have a presence lift that makes guitars very immediate through speakers. Having said that, depending on your amp, you have to think differently. You know, when I've tracked guys like Joe Perry and Ace, a lot of those older guitar players, their sound is incredibly bright. You know, they're not hearing the high end that they used to, and they love their tones to be incredibly bright. So I'm not going to put a 57 on Joe's amp. So I discovered that's when I started using Royers. And I know this is not a cheap mic, so I apologize here, but the 122V, which I think is about 3K, was amazing on his amp because that tube version of a ribbon just kind of rounded off some of that high end.
Right.
But there are inexpensive ribbons that would do the same thing. You just have to be careful. The 122V seems to have a huge amount of SPL for a ribbon. We got it pretty close, maybe that far away, and he was cranking.
Right.
I don't know if I would take a $300 or $400 ribbon and expect it to be that close and work, but at least you could get a ribbon in that situation, and the ribbon will soften up some of that high end.
And Royer does have their R10.
I love the R10.
More affordable and designed for that.
Yep.
Designed for stage use, actually. So they're ruggedized, if you will.
Yeah, I've got to be honest. You know, about speaking out of turn, the R10 might be their best mic. It really, because it's $600-700, I believe, and it's a ribbon. It sounds phenomenal. With the way they've got that corrugated grill on it, that adds to the high end. So it actually has quite a nice detail on the high end for a ribbon. It's a very, very versatile mic. I recommend it all the time, especially if people are looking for pairs of things. Like, where are you going to get a pair of decent sounding ribbons for like just over $1,000 for a pair of them? Right. It's not going to happen. A pair of R10s, a pair of 121s or 122s is a car. So maybe not a Ferrari, but it's definitely like a car.
Something with wheels.
Yeah, something with wheels. But yeah, R10s, I highly recommend those. They're really, really great microphones. So when I get asked a lot, I test out people's kind of knowledge on stuff, because I think jumping into a $3,000 or $4,000 ribbon is great if you know your mics and you've got a massive collection and you know when you're going to use it and it's very specific. But if you're just getting in there and you want to try out your first ribbon, then an R10 is a great way of going. Like, fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that a 57, well, at least a pair of 57, so you can either double mic with, you know, Terry's technique, or put the mic behind, you know, double mic that way. And then large diaphragm condensers. When I worked with Dave Sardi, I did 3 albums with him. We did The Thrills, we did Hot Heat, and then I did all the production on, all the pre-production for Jet. So I did all the demos and everything that went on to be that, you know, the big record. And with that, 67s. So, and you don't have to be a 67, it's basically a large diaphragm condenser. Obviously, a 67 has tubes in it, so it's going to give you a little extra, all those additional harmonics. There are a lot of affordable tube mics out there, but large diaphragm condensers, that's the sound of those records.
Right.
So, you know, there's no right way or wrong way. You just have to be careful with expensive microphones not to cram them up against a Marshall Major 200-watt head, you know, pumping out everything maxed on 10, slapped up the grill. You might damage your very expensive condenser and definitely your ribbon. But if you're thinking about it logically, and again, remembering the more you bring it back, the more low end you're going to get from it, you know, it's an interesting one, because we talk a lot about phase, for instance. I was thinking about this because we just did a masterclass here, and I was asking Shelley Yakus about guitar sounds, and obviously he did Don't Fear the Reaper, and then Jack obviously did all the Aerosmith Rocks and Toys in the Attic. Jay Messina, all these guys that I admire, that I'm friends with, these New York engineers and producers, and I asked them how they got their guitar sounds, and some of them are absolutely phenomenal tones, and they did all kinds of nuts things that nobody would ever do anymore.
Right.
Like multiple microphones. Shelley on Tom Petty's guitar, on Ricochet, and you know, and Damn the Torpedoes, on Damn the Torpedoes, he would do individual microphone on a 212 cab, a different mic on each speaker. So immediately that's, you know, people would be like, that's crazy. And then he liked to put one in between that picked up a rough sound of the two blended together, and then he would pull one back for some more low end. So he had 4 microphones, which would never have proper phase relation.
Right.
You know, going into a console, which he would then EQ the way he wanted it to be and blend it on the console and print it to one track. And often they didn't print it to one track, they would print it in stereo, not panned like left and right hard, like trying to make it feel like 2 guitars, but just so that the guitar kind of sat here, as opposed to being here or being here or being here, or only in that speaker or only that speaker, just so it's a guitar sound. And honestly, you go back and listen to those records and they sound like a guitar in a room, or just a guitar amp, as opposed to like a very heavily compressed and EQ'd, and here's the guitar over here, and we're going to put some reverb over there. And those albums have a sort of naturalness to it. But nobody, I think, thinks like that anymore. Everything has to be like, and I get it, you know, because we're all so obsessed with what things look like, and everybody wants to be technically right when they're leaving their comments. But, you know, there's tons of phase issues going on with that. All those microphones are going to be hearing the speakers at different times. But those guys were smart. They EQ'd them to sit together nicely, they compressed them in the right kind of way, and they got a guitar sound that they felt was like a unique guitar sound. And you go back and listen to Damn the Torpedoes, it's a great sounding record.
Yeah.
And is it in your face, immediate and modern rock? No. But is it full of incredible performances and great tones and great songs? Heck yeah. You know, give me more of that.
Right. I think the difference is that they were really approaching it as, opposed to trying to just get a sound with a mic, they were treating all those mics as kind of one thing. And so they were monitoring them simultaneously. They're listening to them. They're not saying, okay, let's listen to this in isolation. Now we'll listen to this in isolation. It was a whole taken as in the aggregate, if you will.
Absolutely. You pull up any of Shelley or any of those guys' records up on a console and pan them around and level them out. It's the album. The mixing stage would have been a little bit of like, oh, you know, we need to push this up in this section. We need to pull that there. You know, 2 or 3 people on a console that wasn't automated.
Right.
You know, I spoke to Joe Ciccarelli about this. He was talking about like starting off working with Zappa in the late 70s. And he said, at that period, no one engineer worked on a record. It was very rare that, you hired an engineer and you went in for 6 weeks to make an album and it came out the other side, especially working with people like Zappa, who had home studios and worked with tons of different musicians from all over the world. The tapes would be stuck in a suitcase and flown over to wherever he was going to do an overdub with whoever he wanted to work with. So he's like, you prided yourself on the record sounding like a record. So the drums were recorded with EQ, with compression, exactly the way they were supposed to be. You wanted the next guy, if I tracked that and you were pulling it up to do a guitar overdub, to pull it up on the console and go, wow, this sounds great.
Right.
As opposed to like, well, I've got to do this, I've got to do all this work, It was a very, very, very different mentality. Mm-hmm. People are very protective these days of their mixes and all this kind of stuff. In those days, the mixes was built in. All those records that we consider to be masterpieces don't have mix credits because the producer and engineer that recorded it were the mixer.
Right.
So there was no like mixed by.
A little different approach.
There's a whole different approach. You pull it up on fader, it's the album.
Right. Now, an advantage we have today, though, is you can record, say we have 3 microphones, we put a SM57, an R121, and we put a large diaphragm condenser, have them on different tracks. And now in our DAW, we can work with the phase and adjust that. And that can be a very powerful tool, too.
Yeah.
Because you can, maybe what you capture, get it as close as you can, but you can still slide things a little bit. And it's amazing what a difference that can make to the presence that a sound will have.
Absolutely. But you could argue, I think, if you look at these guys' approach, that they were using phase to shape the sound. Mm-hmm. If they were bringing up whatever mic it might be that was reducing some of the low end and making it sit better for them, then do we work on the theory of like it's changing the phase? It's like, yeah, but how does it sound?
Right.
Is it now closer to what they want? There's a right way to do it. When I'd been in America a few years and I went back to the UK to see a friend of mine, and he was making a record with Steve Fitzmaurice. I don't know if anybody watching knows who Steve Fitzmaurice is. Look him up. Irish guy who did Seal's biggest stuff, and also just an incredible engineer, producer, mixer, ridiculously talented guy. And they were doing an Ian Brown record from the Stone Roses. So I was in Olympic before they closed Olympic down. So I was there with my friend Dave McCracken, and he was co-producing with Steve this huge Ian Brown record. Had this great song called Fear on it. And we were in there, and I remember looking over, and they had racks of 888s. And I'd been in America, and everybody used Apogee for good reason. Apogee stuff is absolutely incredible. So me being, the punk kid who wanted to sound like I knew what I was talking about, was like, how come you don't use Apogee? And he said, well, there's kind of 2 ways of doing it. There's doing it right, and there's doing it so it sounds good. And I think that's something we have to remember. We can always be like, oh, you can't use this or you can't use that because of this, and this. Or you can just take what you've got and make really great sounds out of it. Mm-hmm. I know we're in a world now where every other video that goes up onto YouTube, where I presume this is living, that's the debate. That wasn't done right.
Yeah.
It wasn't right. It's better. It's under every video comment ever.
Mm-hmm.
We had Reed Shippen. We did a masterclass in Nashville with him. Well, masterclass in Nashville, and he came down and spoke to the students, and he was describing how he was mixing something, and one of the students said, but doesn't that cause phase issues? And he said, yeah, precisely. That's why it sounds better, because I was using it, I was pushing up the EQ here. And
right. Yeah, phase can be good or it can be bad.
Yeah.
Depending on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And having probably the key to all of this is having a target in mind. It's hard to go into the studio and say, okay, we're going to get a guitar sound and it's going to do this, as opposed to having a picture of what you want that guitar sound to be and then working to achieve that sound. And I think when I talked to a lot of those older engineers, producers who worked in that era, they had a much more vivid mental picture of what they were going for.
Absolutely.
And the players certainly did as well.
Well, it's the age-old argument you hear all the time. It's committing. It's committing. They were committing to sounds. Mm-hmm. And the reason why so many of those records were made with 24 tracks or less, 24, 16, 8 or 4, was because they were able to commit and then make a decision. So the next part, either combination of the performance, the part itself, and the sound was dictated by the stuff that was already down, that was already committed to tape. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why those records can be so huge. You know, I think even going back to like the Bends, which is one of my favorite records. I love Radiohead, the Bends. I love OK Computer. I know that's the Bends wasn't successful in America like it was in Europe. So it was OK Computer that kind of got really big here. So I know it's name check a lot, which is a masterpiece. But for me, the Bends is the album that kind of changed Radiohead from kind of a almost pseudo grunge rock band into like the band that they are now. And if you listen to it, it's Radiohead, so you think there's 45 things going on at all times. I dare anybody watch this, go back and listen to it. It's not like that at all. There's like one or two guitar parts. It's just sonically the tones are phenomenal. The ideas are incredible. I've talked to John Leckie, the producer of that project, many times about that record. And it was a lot of pre-production, a lot of like hashing it out. And one of my favorite stories is My Iron Lung. You know that for fans of the band, you know when it goes to that crazy section.
Right.
They cut the song. In the studio. Took as long as it took, and they just weren't really sure about it. But you know, they were like, yeah, maybe it's as good as it's going to be. And MTV were in London, and they did a show at, I think it was the Garage. I can't remember. Anyway, they did a show in London, and MTV recorded it on a 16 track. That night, they went off and they played their show, and they did some new songs, one of which was My Iron Lung. And the next day, they come back into the studio, and they start going back through the songs, and they pull up My Own Lung, and they're just like, it's just not working. There's just something lacking in this. And John Leckie said, you played that last night. Didn't they record it? It's like, yeah. So they get the tapes, the 16 track, and they cut in that crazy section from the live performance into the 24 track master. Obviously, they would have to bounce it from a 16 track to 24 and assign it. And if everybody watching this, go back and listen to it, everything changes. The whole drum sound, the guitars. I've never known anybody that I've told that story to who knew that it happened. Yeah. No, nobody's ever said to me, I can really tell there was an edit there. And you know, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people now that will tell me they've always knew, but I've never heard anybody say that. And it was just doing what was best.
Right.
And it is insane. It's just a nuts section. It makes no sense, but that's why we all love it. You've got a pair of headphones on, and you have that, you have that incredible, that weird twisted guitar, and it's just like, wow, this is so energetic. It's live, yeah, because it is. It was a live performance. That sort of reckless abandon doesn't have to be in everything that we do. I'm not saying, yeah, we need to always throw out the baby with the bathwater and just do craziness, but we just have to be open to not always doing the right thing, because it restricts us so much, and just do whatever it might be. It might be blending virtual instruments with real guitars. You might be recording, a guitar amp in a bathroom with the door open, or it might be the opposite way around, the guitar amp in the lounge, and then you stick the mic in the bathroom for the amps. Who the heck knows? But whatever you've got, whatever gear you have, whatever pedals you use, just find unique ways of using them.
Right.
And then, which would be wonderful. I'd love to hear more records like that, and a little less like, oh, this guitar sound works, so I'm just going to cut the whole record. And that's one of the things I loved when I'm working with some of those guys that made those records. I have a Joe Perry story. We did this song that was in G.I. Joe. It was called Legendary Child. And it has this huge guitar sound, which is a Marshall stack in my old live room, which was enormous. Marshall stack, close mic, and also mic'd up in the room with two pairs of stereo mics, so this huge guitar sound. But then we had the Pro Junior with a ribbon microphone on it, and then also splitting into an arbiter fuzz going into the front of a Neve. So we had the pedal just for that Jimmy Page kind of
nastiness.
That kind of like choking guitar. So fuzz pedal, Neve overdriven, kind of stop-start guitar sound, Pro Junior, natural, Marshall, massive ambience. So we're talking like 2, 4, 5, 6, front and back, 7, 8, like 8, maybe 8 inputs going in for this guitar sound. And I remember we tracked it, and it took ages to get the sound. Different guitars, different pedals, whatever, also cable. This is a big one. We had this really long, like 300-foot guitar cable, which just all the high end had gone by the end.
Right.
So we had to get a better quality cable. Plus then we got the what do they call those boxes where you run the signals, you come in low impedance, high impedance, then run low impedance, then dump. So it took a while. It was like a day to get this guitar sound, which was great, and I'm very proud of it. At the end of the guitar sound, I'm thinking, we just got the world's biggest guitar sound. Now we're going to go and put it on 5 songs. He's like, great, so that's the verse. Let's do the chorus sound. I'm like, what? You know, these guys, I always think of, I had the good fortune to meet Eddie Van Halen, to work, Jeff Beck as well, Ace Frehley, Joe Perry, all of these guys, and they're all big kids. And I mean that in the best possible way. They're all still like 18 years old and excited about playing guitar. Mm-hmm. And to them, what is better than spending a day to get a guitar sound that only appears in the verses?
Right. That's fantastic.
Why do they do this?
Yeah.
And to have something that's completely unique.
Right.
Why would they want to go, oh, here's virtual setting preset number 4 that sounds really massive, and don't worry, it's on the radio, everybody uses it.
Right.
That's not why they did this. They got into it because they listened to, you know, Buddy Guy or something playing with Muddy Waters, mm-hmm. you know, or Muddy Waters, or, you know, Elmore James or something like this. Sure. They heard these sounds and they wanted to be that. You know, and I love that quote from Zappa, wasn't it? When they were talking about guitar playing, and it's in that Ralph Denyer guitar book where he just talks about, like, he just wants the nastiest guitar sounds. You know? That's what the electric guitar is, you know. Yeah. And so whatever you've got, whatever gear you've got, that's what I want to encourage. You know, just do your thing. And I think really, like a fuzz pedal, a distortion pedal, a small amp, and a microphone, and a virtual amp, you should be able to do some crazy stuff.
You should be able to cover a lot of ground with that, and to bring it back around. Yep. That's sort of the beauty of the modern era, if you will, is you can be at home. You can spend as much time as you want crafting your sounds. Even in an apartment, you can do a tiny little amp. And I'm talking tiny little amp with a microphone in front of it and get surprising sounds. Combine that with direct sounds, with reamping things, with using plugins, with using virtual amps, with using IRs, and you have just this huge palette that you can draw from to really create something unique that will add to your sound.
Oh, we had some fun times. We did, so I made the mistake, in a good sense, of telling Joe about the Truth album with Beck, mm-hmm. where on that song, that Ain't Superstitious, this like really big fat guitar sound. And I had read that to get it to be so low-endy, they put a full-blown Marshall stack, it might have even been a major, something ridiculous, whatever it was, like a full-blown Marshall stack in a cupboard, closed the door, and then mic'd the door. So I told him about it. I was like, that sound is so massive because there's so much low end. And he's like, great, let's do that. And I was like, no. So we got a full Marshall stack, put it in a cupboard, closed the door, mic'd the door, turned everything up. And the guitar, of course, was like almost no high end. It was leaking just enough out to get some in there. But it was just this massive guitar sound. And we did blend in, obviously, like a Pro Junior for a bit of bite. But it was enormous. And I remember when we came to mix it, we were like, you pull up the guitars and you're like, it was basically all guitars or not. It was such a huge guitar sound. Right. And it became a real challenge, you know, to kind of sculpt it. Because you didn't want to ruin everything that was so special about it, but you did have to reduce some of that low end because it was so massive. But yeah, it wasn't expensive gear, it was the creativity.
Right. Try things out. You're not going to break anything.
Yeah.
Very cool.
This is fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for sitting down. I mean, we could talk about, we haven't even gotten to acoustic guitars. Maybe we'll do another video about acoustic.
Let's do another video about acoustic guitars.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Thanks, Mitch.
Happy to have you here at Sweetwater.
Lots of fun.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us today. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. I hope that you enjoyed this installment of the Plugged In Podcast by Sweetwater. Our thanks to Warren Huart for sitting down with us for this podcast. It was just a blast digging into guitar with him. Now, several videos from his visit at Sweetwater have already posted to his Produce Like a Pro channel on YouTube, as well as to Sweetwater's YouTube channel, so be sure to check those out. And we have to give big thanks to the amazing team in Sweetwater Studios for hosting this interview. Remember to start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs. And while you're there, you can also check out Sweetwater Studios and all of the events taking place there. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mitch Gallagher, and this has been the Plugged In Podcast by Sweetwater.